Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 940th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and today I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Andrew Woolbright and Gitte Maria Möller and Tom McGlynn. We are thrilled to welcome poet Katie Naughton here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Artist, curator, and critic Andrew Woolbright is based in Brooklyn and is an MFA graduate from RISD in painting. Woolbright is the founder and director of the gallery Below Grand on the Lower East Side. He currently teaches at the School of Visual Arts and Pratt Institute, and we are so lucky to have him as an editor-at-large here at the Rail. And Gitte Maria Möller received her BAFA from the Michaelis School of Fine Art in 2015. She lives and works in Cape Town, South Africa, and has exhibited extensively, both locally and internationally. Drawing from religious painting, dream symbology, early video games, online fan art, and references to childhood, Gitte's work holds a complex array of signs, symbols, and archetypes in suspension. And our host today, artist, writer, and independent curator Tom McGlynn is based in the New York area. His work is represented in permanent collections of the Whitney, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum of the Smithsonian. He is the director of Beautiful Fields, an organization dedicated to socially engaged curatorial projects, and is also a visiting lecturer at Parsons. Tom is also an editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you all so very much for being here and being in conversation today. And over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Eleanor, and to all my indefatigable colleagues at the Rail for making these so smooth and important documents. It's been a pleasure getting to know you, Gitte, and I obviously know Andrew as a colleague at the Rail, but not as much as a painter, to the extent that the the tandem exhibition between both of you exhibits. So I think we'll start with you, Andrew. We just for everybody's information, Gitte and Andrew we've had a previous discussion in the gallery, and it was very fruitful, and it touched on some points between Gitte and Andrew's work, and then some diversions as well. So I'm going to try to balance this discussion as much as possible. I'm sure it'll take on a life of its own, but starting with Andrew, I'm going to quote something that you wrote. I think this is great essay that Andrew wrote that's appropriate to this exhibit and his work. It's an article called "Office Landscape: A Genealogy of Corporate Critique," and in it, Andrew kind of unpacks his relation and perhaps a larger cultural relation to the plethora of images and the branding of those images that takes place, and the kind of the consumer interface with those images and how they get processed in artists' work. So he introduces this essay saying that artists, they're capable of producing ironic works of critical estrangement in relation to disrupting principles of Taylorism or scientific management in the office. So that's specific to that particular essay, but I do think it's relevant to Andrew's work, obviously, and to some extent, Gitte's work as well. So maybe we can focus on one of Andrew's paintings, Eleanor, just to kind of maybe one of the larger conglomerations. Yeah, so there's a collage element to your work, Andrew, that it exemplifies this kind of statement about grappling with the kind of fire hose of imagery and corporate identity and the interface of like social media with everyday life, and how you're using that in your canvases, literally. I mean, you're literally kind of depicting that kind of over visualization of multiple different streams of culture.
Yeah. I mean, I think interfacing is a really great word, Tom. And a lot of these paintings start off as kind of allegorical, or like a body of research or an archive I keep in a folder about a central idea. And I try to not like really get into it or disclose what it is. And then for me, it's that process of detail versus swarm, like trying to keep something, like what a detail does within a painting, its ability to make a painting more convincing, but also like disrupt it, and make it feel like no longer a painting. And I think to answer kind of where you're going or what you started with it, I am still really interested in this moment where, artists like Richard Hamilton and some of these pop artists, they're really confronting images, and they're saying like, is this a collage or is this a painting? Is this an image or is this a painting? Like, when does this become something else? And like, I'm interested in that interface of self, or that kind of cyborgian, grotesque of self, that's also what you think you are versus how you change over time from all these little virtual affects that come along.
Right. I mean, there's this obvious history in like surrealism and art historical references, not necessarily explicit in your work, but like in terms of method, in terms of depicting a stream of conscious, like literally, and then it's just kind of all presented there. And I think for me, the collage represents an indeterminacy of expression, which, in terms of the interface, it does kind of exemplify the inability, perhaps, of the subject to assimilate all of this mediated imagery. But I think it's interesting that you say that you're not really interested in synthesizing them to a determinate end, that you're actually just interested in presenting them in this way, in an indeterminate way. I mean, is that an accurate reading?
Kind of. I mean, like I think a lot about. I still think like the telos, or the reason for painting, or I ask like, what can painting still do? And I still think that there's interesting things that happen when a painting tries to confront an image, or like has a relationship to collage or images, and deconstructing that. And for me, it's what I owe, or what I feel like I owe the audience, or what I hope gets through, is like, these are like that endless scroll, or that downward gravity of the feed. Like, I feel like I owe a slower time. So like, a lot of these paintings are accumulations over years, like years of working on the same painting and adding and adding and adding. But the other thing is, I hope that there's a, not to get too woo woo, but like a little bit of a metaphysics in it, that like, what happens when you bury so much into a painting? Like, maybe the exact references don't come across, but maybe like, in kind of this like Baldessari way, like the more you try to cover something up, there's like a latent energy exposed, So like, I'm excited about, I guess, like the affective feeling that's maybe produced from these. as opposed to like the textual or the literal meaning of like going through and being like, this is from this is from that. I hope it's generous.
Right. Now, I in my research, I came upon this Alexander Galloway quote where he describes the interface as an agitation or generative friction between different formats. We can get into that later with both of your work, because I think both of you are doing that to some extent. But this idea of like, you know, a given format finding its identity merely in the fact that it's a container for another format. In a way, painting has done that. You know, I mean, that's the constancy of painting, perhaps, right?
Totally.
This vehicle that, you know, this kind of vessel that you can kind of fill, but then it becomes, the history of painting becomes an interface that creates this agitation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I want to hand it over to Gitte, but I do think of these paintings as like hard drives, or I think of them as containers for a lot of gesture and ideas. And, you know, like if you work at something over the course of 3 years, you're a different person by the time you end it, you know? So I'm interested in that aspect of it. But they are closed networks, closed systems, closed loops. That's very important to it. And we talked about it in our meeting, but like, for me, the real artifice or the attraction is that, you know, painting is a very virtual experience, the same way that like social media is. And like, I think Giacometti was a very virtual painter, and that's why I love him.
Right. I was noticing in that earlier detail that you're talking about the allegorical, and this will lead into talking about Gitte's work. The Tower of Babel on that
the camcorder.
The camcorder screen has the image of the Tower of Babel. So I mean, that's obvious to me. That's an obvious allegorical reference to the inability of like people to actually communicate in this kind of hierarchical structure.
Totally, but
it could be read as the ambition, the egalitarian ambition of like the internet, and the ultimate like mess, you know, the ultimate like lack of communication that actually happens because of the very superstructure that was set up that way, you know.
Totally, but I mean, also like those are all such beautiful paintings. They are destructive. They are a demolition. But it's also like very important to me that they're, you know, they're the destructive, they're the end of the textual relationship to things. It's language falling apart so that civilization can take over, you know, like the end of Babel is the end of a unified meaning of the text.
Right, because I mean, they were ostensibly, you know, trying to build a tower to heaven, which is like a hierarchical, you know, situation. So yeah, it could be read that way. It could be read many different ways, but that's like perhaps a negative reading of it, right? But I mean, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I think thinking about painting as a screen is like an interesting thing to think about for me, because well, firstly, being on Zoom and talking about painting feels exposing in this way, because I feel like I paint because a painting is like it's like a kind of a guard or a screen between me and the outside world. You know, it's like a shield basically, and if you talk about it as a container to pour feelings into, you creating this like, I guess a safe vessel or something for your soul, basically.
Right. That's interesting. You know, it's interesting to think about that in terms of like a non-accessible, like a non-agitated interface, right? It's like
that's what it is. I think that's where my and Andrew's work maybe differs, because I definitely think of it as like, in the end, it's a kind of closed system. It has an ending for me. I very much my paintings have a hard edge. They're very smooth, they have a very hard edge, they very much end. And in that way, yeah, they're a closed system, and I can kind of feel like they're separate from me.
Could we go to one of Eleanor? Could we go to one of Gitte's more allegorical paintings?
And the
That's a good one. No, not these. The next one, perhaps.
yeah,
well, it's interesting. We did talk about that. We talked about the aspect of the hermetic in our discussion, in our early discussion.
Yeah.
And also the realm of fantasy, and how the realm of fantasy could be, you know, a closed system.
Mm.
And then often the realm of fantasy, say like in a high art historical context, it's either sequestered into surrealism, or it's not necessarily taken seriously.
Mm.
because of its hermetic address, right? So not only because of that, but
yeah, like pseudo spiritualism kind of.
right. And there's, you know, I think in my notes I was also talking about what might be like a powerful aspect of it, and that's the one of the reviewers of a show of yours from 2019 mentioned that they were overwrought and heavy-handed metaphors of youth. And I mentioned, you know, there could be something that like maybe like a teenager writes on the back of their notebook.
Yeah.
Combining like heavy metal with, you know, like Tolkien or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And that there's a diaristic aspect of that, but there's also a kind of a teenage angst that's, you know, it's an interesting area of exploration, because it's you know, the adolescence is kind of like the epitome of the unresolved, right?
Yeah, totally. But I think it's a very important phase of life. And I feel like through through using those elements in my work, I'm kind of elevating that those feelings to a, I don't know, yeah, to a higher status, I suppose. And like being reverential towards them and remembering them.
Right. Well, yeah, it brings up the question is like, why, you know, why do we force that irresolution into kind of a determinate, you know, thing? You know, it's like it's obviously it's an aspect of adulthood, but
yeah, well, it's because we are forced to grow up.
But so much is lost. I mean, but there's also the tradition in women painters, like I have an example, Eleanor, of Agnes Pelton at the end there. There's other no, two more forward. So so this is an example of Agnes Pelton, you know, a kind of a visionary artist who lived in the Southwest, who's been somewhat recently just rediscovered. And, you know, so the stylizations of this kind of work in the past would be considered reactionary or retrograde or just illustrative, but there's kind of a new awareness of this work as being somewhat more like a recuperation of what you're saying. You know, it's a recuperation of that energy of wonder, and it kind of, and there's also these kind of these, you know, literal boundaries that are kind of made misty and then come into fruition. I mean,
yeah, it's like magic, mysticism,
right?
Like a kind of childlike wonder. Yeah, I would say that's very important in my work.
Right.
And it's not because I'm trying to be fluffy. I feel like it's because it's almost the opposite.
Well, I mean, obviously, you know, the recalibration of all those gender roles, you know, it
Yeah.
does allow these things to actually become reconsidered in a much more serious way, you know, not just
Yeah,
consigned to you know, a lesser art of a lesser god or something, you know,
exactly. Yeah.
for gods. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so but there's also an aspect that you do share with Andrew in terms of um, some of the references from pop culture. Um, like if I hate to keep on making you go back and forth, Eleanor, but if you could go back to the end in the Wolfenstein reference, the video game reference.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess my dad used to play Wolfenstein in the 90s, and yeah, after work, and I would just like sit on his lap and watch him play. And yeah, that really stuck in my mind, I guess. Because yeah, you would just be this American soldier going through these dungeon floors on your way to find Hitler, I guess, who was wearing this kind of like crazy suit on the final level. But yeah, a lot of my work references, well, yeah, I guess a lot of my work has references to video games, 90s video games, early 2000s video games like Age of Empires and Tomb Raider 2, because these were just things I grew up with. So it kind of makes sense to me to reference them because it just feels symbolically resonant to me. Yeah, so, and they're beautiful to me. They're these beautiful, fantastical spaces that yeah, they like landscapes to me, internal landscapes.
Right, that same
Um,
reviewer referred to them as well, he referred to the concept of, you know, digital media as like limitless virtual worlds that were promised by the advent of digital technologies now beginning to resemble a solitary and isolated purgatory.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So these
Um,
again, this aspect of the hermetic and the literal format of these walls comes through in some of your paintings, like the
yeah. Yeah, it's like a place to find. It's like it's strange because they're these very violent spaces, but they feel kind of safe at the same time because they are very contained systems.
so
So
which
if you
painting,
play in safe mode or you've killed all the baddies, you can kind of just like wander around
right?
and look at the trees and the flowers. Yeah.
Do you know? Do you have the title of the work for Eleanor to find that would be like
A
show
pushy passion.
show like the direct correlation between these walls and kind of like some of your architectural fantasies in your paintings?
Oh, the cross painting.
Can we look at that, Eleanor? There's a cross format painting.
It should be yeah, it's 51. Yeah.
Yeah. So there we can see like a direct correlation. You said you substituted some of the swastikas for those those,
Yeah, the anime angels, yeah.
and obviously, I mean, this is such the image of the broken heart in a pool in the middle, and it's kind of like this bubble heart to boot, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it can't be anything but, you know, for me anyway, I shouldn't speak for everybody else, but it can't be anything but like, you know, kind of a hyperbolic quotation, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But at the same time, you're saying, you know, you're also interested in that kind of pushy passion.
Yeah. That's actually I saw the title comes from so in South Africa a lot of people get around using these like minibus taxis. They like, yeah, they're kind of like small combis, I guess. And they often have like decal stickers that say like bad boy or like, you know, something like edgy or whatever. So this one taxi said cushy passion on it. And it just made me think about my dad because that was his vibe. Um, yeah, he was just very pushy with his love. So
That's great.
yeah, so that's kind of that's why I used this title. So
And
yeah, again, I guess the title kind of also like ties a little bit back to my home in a way, but also to my dad. And yeah,
it's a great poetic quotation. And this painting is a little bit different than some of your other paintings because of its cruciform format.
yeah,
But I'm going to use it as an opportunity to come back to Andrew in terms of
yeah,
the physicality of his presentations and the format of his paintings. And
definitely.
you know, there's a physical embodiment in both of your work. In your work, Gitte, with the hangings.
Yeah,
Of a reliquary, but in Andrew's work, like in this example, the ancillary framing and the kind of scaffolding that if we could see a detail, I don't know if we have any details, Andrew, but of the framing, there's these little kind of quotations that they feel like reliquary quotations. So like that in this example in the upper left there's a small print. I think it's from the 18th century, Andrew.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the grotto is a really important motif within my work, and so I collect paintings and drawings and any in grottos, and then all of the history of designing nymphiums and fountains as this like infinite point in a city that seems very utopic. And you know, early robotics and automatons were introduced into it. So that's a painting of a grotto that kind of informed the way I painted the arch in the painting. And I mean, like they, because as Gitte pointed out, we're different in some ways that like I get really disappointed when a painting comes to an end. Like I'm always trying to like sustain a painting forever, you know, like it at some point I know I have to close it off, but when it does, these frames kind of feel like a way of doing it in a way on my terms because I think of them as like marginalia or illuminated manuscripts, but also somewhere between that and like a pop-up window, like screens opening up on your laptop that kind of show the research nodes of how the painting was made. Um,
Right, but they're interesting to me in the sense they also they bring forth like older technology, like you know, hard iron, like clamps, and the opposite of the virtual.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I mean, I really, I kind of like being fastidious when it comes to sculpture and everything. Like I wanted to make everything myself. Like I thought that was sense of ironic tension of like no fabrication or like nothing you can buy from a store. So I tried to, these were all wood carvings that I then cast and did molds of to kind of end up with these ambivalent forms that seem like they might be something you find at a hardware store, but something you might find at a custom hard drives shop or like a Best Buy to like, you know, make your computer have more RAM.
right, they have these interesting kind of like techno stylizations
Mm-hmm.
that you know, like different companies will use to kind of make their work, make their ancillary things to the computers like more interesting, you know, like more groovy or stylized, kind of like a. But it's also interesting in relation to how we're talking about Gitte's work, in that these stylizations are also I mean, that clamp on the top could be like a flying buttress on like Notre Dame, you know. So
Totally.
so those things have like genealogies that refer to, and I think you know, if I recall, you mentioned like feudal social systems as well in some of your writings, Andrew. This may be reach, but you know, there is an aspect of how we're all subject to this mediated landscape as serfs, you know, that we're just kind of you know, like micro serfs, or we're, you know, there is a metaphoric point to be made that this mediated landscape is just a larger estate, you know, that we all kind of are spectators, you know, we work with spectators. So
I mean, at one point in the show, I was thinking of these as like LARPing as a guild painter, you know, like proto-Renaissance, medieval. Like, I'm really interested in how, you know, and this is no judgment on any side of it, but studying the history of art is also studying the history of patronage and studying the history of collection and like the history of like how these pictures end up in a history book, you know. And I find that all really fascinating. And like I don't know. I mean, I feel like a lot of my work is jokes that might not land for anyone else, but like I find it kind of funny to make something that looks like high tech as an aesthetic. And so to like be in a wood shop and dremeling out something and covered in sawdust to make something that looks high tech is funny to me, in like what I hope is a productive way. And I think that like guild and patronage and feudalism feels very appropriate in like kind of ways that like we talked about it, and then I want to get back to Gitte's work, but this I'm interested in this moment where Dürer is like the first celebrity artist of Europe, and he's always drawing Saint Jerome and like the cave, and you have this patronage system of painting the Pope or drawing the king or drawing that, and the cave is the place where you can, you know, draw the nightmare or draw the demon or paint, you know, the grotesque. And for me, that's very much something I think about all the time, which is like you have the dream world that goes back 100,000 years, and then you have the patronage world, which is the last 600 or 700, really.
Well, that, you know, that cleaves really well with like you know, switching to Gitte's work. Sorry if I was mispronouncing your name earlier.
No.
And because besides the video game references, Gitte has also referenced the Northern Renaissance. Speaking of Dürer, and she mentioned Hans Memling's allegory of true love, which Eleanor is at the back there. So it's the Memling, the actual Memling painting. I think we had that, right? It might be at the very beginning. It's at the, there it is, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, speaking of the Northern Renaissance, here's a Memling painting, obviously done under patronage, right? But it contains these allegorical fantasy worlds, and might be a good way for you to jump in here, Gitte.
Yeah, so I was like looking at a lot of Annunciation painting, but then which is obviously also, it's Mary and the angel Gabriel, so it's also like two figures, like not a split panel, but like a similar composition. But then I came across this painting and it was doing something similar. And I read up a bit about the painting and found out that the one panel is in Brussels and the one panel is here at the Met. which I thought was very romantic, that they are split up across continents. And yeah, so this was the inspiration for the first painting I made while I was here in the States. Yeah, which is this one. So yeah, I ended up kind of, I guess, painting this horse crossing two worlds. But my way of working is very, it's extremely intuitive. I don't really like, I guess I started with the wood grain. So it kind of becomes this, as my friend Mitchell said in his early sort of write-ups, like a Herculean task of just doing patterns. And as I'm doing this, I can kind of dream about the symbols that I'm going to put into the painting. So sometimes there'll be like little other creatures underneath the like layers of color that you can't see. I know that they are there, but they've kind of gotten lost. So the only things that are left are the moon and the two trees, and the fairy stroking the bug and the horse. And I suppose I can say that I was feeling quite lonely when I was making this painting, and I made it over about 4 months. So my paintings take quite long to make. And I wasn't working on anything else at the time. So yeah, in that sense, I guess it's a similar way of working to like old I wouldn't say I'm not a master painter, a master oil painter, but I like that idea of spending really long on an oil painting. And I wish I could spend 10 years on something, but unfortunately there's no patronage system like that right now.
Well, the thing I find interesting about the juxtaposition of the Memling in this painting is like, you have translated those arches into kind of an Archschwager, like an Archschwager type of like ersatz, faux wood, right? So I mean, it's you're creating this, this trompe l'oeil version, but it does feel a little bit like the figuration that you might see in like a video game.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, because of my lack of skill, I can't paint a beautiful lady like this. So I had to find this fairy figure on the internet and paint her really, really, really tiny, and paint like a tiny horse, because I can't paint a beautiful big horse because I didn't go to like a painting academy. I went to I don't know, like the art school I went to is great, but it was very conceptual, based in conceptual practice. So any skill I have as a painter is self-taught.
Right, and we talked about that too in our conversation.
Yeah, so that's interesting. It's like a lot of what I paint is really also determined by what I'm able to render as a painter, which I think is interesting. Like what my hand is able to do.
Right, and we have a comment from GE, which I was thinking about too, in terms of how you're dealing with scale in this painting.
Yeah.
The diminished scale of like what's happening, as opposed to like the Memling.
Yeah.
This horse and these two trees make an inverted like triangle.
Yes.
It's very destabilizing. Like you have the symmetrical windows, but then you have this inverted triangle in the center, which totally destabilizes it. And then further it gets destabilized with this little kind of in the wings action with the fairy and the bug.
Yeah.
Interesting how your eye kind of goes through this, but I think it's activated to a large extent by the scale shifts.
Yeah, and I think that creates a kind of like yeah, like a loneliness in the landscape, which I think is interesting as well. And
Similar to
maybe
Jericho.
yeah. So it's kind of like a happy accident, which I think is lovely in a way.
There's
Yeah.
a lot of humor too. I mean, Andrew was talking about, in jokes in his work, and
Yeah.
it's kind of like, Stubbs, like, Horace that's kind of bisected in the middle. It's like those thoroughbred pictures from like the 18th century or the 19th century.
Yeah.
It seems like a transgression against that kind of like propriety or something.
Well, I was also thinking about this because I in my other paintings I painted like My Little Pony. So this was also my thing. I was like, well, I need to grow up and like paint a real horse.
It's very fun.
Because I obviously have there's the painting from 2020 with the like upside down Pegasus, which is just like a reference to a My Little Pony cartoon.
Is that in the slideshow, Gitte?
Yeah.
We find that.
But it's like it's a very serious painting, but it's got a My Little Pony in it. Well, it's serious to me, but also not. I don't know. It's funny. I guess painting, yeah, it can be both.
Well, I mean, the idea of appropriating, to some extent, appropriating pop, recognizable pop. Is this this is not the one you're talking about?
No, it's 34.
It's 34.
Yeah, that's the one.
Well, I was going to say the idea of appropriating pop iconography is that it makes it accessible, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about the subject. It's not just about like the subject of it's not just about pop irony. It's about accessibility on a very base level. So people understand that where they might not understand.
It's interesting though, because I feel like this work in a way was not accessible. I was painting this stuff in Cape Town and people didn't really find it accessible because I was painting My Little Pony in oil. People were like, what is this? Like, why are you doing this? But now I think it's catching on a little bit more.
And then there are motifs like that surrounding. Well, it reminds me of the fountain in
the horse's shape. Yeah.
Right. So you're appropriating Northern Renaissance motifs and then combining them with like these pop cultural references.
Yeah, well, I was thinking of the story of the unicorn, and maybe in the garden, and the unicorn taming of the unicorn, Mary's virginity, that whole thing.
And then you have the heart again, like, but in this kind of like whole world thing, which is again conflating like kind of a cliche with a cliche or something.
Yeah, I'm not stopping.
Do you want to jump in here, Andrew?
About the role of cliche? I mean,
well, maybe about the role of like, the appropriation of high, of low, so-called low art into the high art context to make it accessible.
I mean, I think of I'm very comfortable. I think of myself as an ironist, and like I think people oftentimes put irony on a spectrum of sincerity, and I don't think they have anything to do with each other. Like, I'm interested in what can be created by opposing oppositional forces, and I guess I'm always trying to create dialectics where I can. And so for me, like I think about like legibility very much in terms of that. Like, like where something becomes over rendered, that maybe it becomes a thing that kind of like breaks the painting, versus where something is like provisional. Like for me, that's why my paintings have to be paintings, is that like when I choose to paint like, you know, a TripAdvisor review and I spend more time on that than anything else in the painting, it becomes it breaks the cohesion of the surrealist event, you know. Like I always think of painting as like cultivating desire and disrupting desire in hopefully a way that sustains all of it. And so like when I use this color palette, it is like addictive forming, you know. It is like the color palette of like an iridescent bubble, like a soap bubble, but it's also a downloadable virtual space. And like I'm always trying to counteract that then with like something that is actually difficult to that world building, you know. I guess that's how I think about it.
And we also talked about it earlier about like being kind of like viscera,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
ectoplasmic viscera, and you mentioned the film Donnie Darko.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which we actually have a poster of.
Yeah.
And so in a nutshell, like, can you like just like repeat what you said to me when
Yeah.
I thought it was really fascinating.
I really like, and also it ties into Gitte's work too, that you know, like, so the character in this, he has a sense of his destiny by following this like really goopy like bubble that comes out of his body and tells him where to walk in this path. And it's like the same CGI for like the T2 Terminator robot, and it's the same CGI for the Thing, and it's like early reflective goo. And like I also think there's a relationship to like Gitte's Wolfenstein painting, that like what Gitte was saying, how that trap space also feels safe. I also like that like those tiles, like I always love the moment, and I think a lot of people do, this is a little bit of my own cliche, that like those tiles represent a floor and a ceiling, but you can also pass through them if you mess up the game in just the right way. That like it's translucent or it's passable, you know. And I like that kind of.
They just have one it's like a, how do you say, it's just like that. So if you start with the character at a certain angle, you can kind of like
It's
pass
exactly it.
bodies through it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like in Tomb Raider, the leaves, the trees are like that.
Yeah.
The leaves are all like this.
Yeah, exactly that. I always like the flicker of physical objects in virtual space. That like the most heavy physical thing, you know, is just a textural wrap around like a, there's no organs inside of it. And I guess I've always wanted to paint the externalized organs too, like the things you follow in the metaphysical.
Yeah.
And it also underscores the kind of inevitability that a painting is simultaneously a picture and a thing.
Absolutely.
It tends to allegorize that.
Mm-hmm.
But along the lines of what you were just talking about, Andrew, I wanted to, if you don't mind, read a quote from your office landscaping piece that I started off our discussion with. Now, you refer to this as a new romanticism enacted through the hacking of corporate aesthetics and language, generating new mythologies which can in turn inspire future critiques by appropriating the color palette, sounds, textures, jargon, and effects that have been weaponized against consumers. Artists gestured towards an ethical recalibration. So I think this is interesting in regards to what you just said about sometimes people reducing irony to somewhere on the spectrum of sincerity. I really hate that when people do that, because it's like the possibilities of irony are so much more invested in overturning expectations, as far as I'm concerned, rather than reinforcing them.
And totally. And I think an important irony for me, you know, like it is the Baroque virtual space, you know, like our cities and buildings are falling apart. There's lead in the pipes, but there's they're going to spend $1 billion on the next Grand Theft Auto game. You know, there's like a massive scale of indulgence and fantasy. And for me, since I'm using that to try to cultivate a sense of desire, I think a lot about obligation. And that's like an important part of that irony for me, which is like there's a Paul McCarthy quote from an old interview, and I need to find it. If anyone can find it, please send it to me. But like the mask slips for a second, and he's like, "I hate this shit." Like he's talking about the Hummels and everything he makes, and he's like, "But I didn't get to be born in Italy in the 1400s. I don't get to work with stained glass and marble. I was born in the Hollywood foothills. I was born in Disneyland, and so I have to make a chapel out of the seven dwarves." And like that for me is like
Yeah.
that's how I scale. My paintings start with a very personal thing I don't want to talk about, and then it's about distancing as much as I can through obligation, which is what does desire look like now? And that's often spaces that I'm not super attached to, like virtual, yeah.
What we're looking at now is a couple of grotto systems, and when you were talking about grottos earlier, thinking about the idea of the picturesque, and like how that idea can be, how you can apply the picturesque, which is generally a distancing, a way of including the past and the present in the same picture. But in picking up some of the lines of our conversation, you can also see it as kind of a way to deal with the constant like mutability of imagery today, and like fixing it in kind of like a perspectival or a picturesque kind of set piece.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I love the set design, and also going back to that past present thing. Like that's why that's one of the many reasons I like science fiction, which is that like as a genre, a lot of science fiction is like something from the distant past, something from the present, something from the future, all converge by the end of the novel to like make sense together. And I always wanted to make work that doesn't feel like it's in any one time, but kind of jumps similar ideas through multiple times. And it was great to do this show with Gita and have this so well curated by Rebecca, because they let me put that little grotto painting on top of that crazy like Bauhaus chair painting that like I really like doing a grotto system drawing that feels ancient, picturesque, but also the body and the neural network and everything at once.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of the picturesque is something that Dan Graham and Robert Smithson talked about, and they used it as a lever to, get outside of that, formalist conversation or formalist agonistics that they found themselves in the late, 50s and early 60s. And so it's kind of for me, it becomes like an idea of like a structural application of irony. Rather than irony in terms of like the subject or something like that.
Totally.
So you understand that distinction, right? I mean, it seems
yeah. No, I like. I mean, I guess that's, if I'm understanding correctly, it's like it's forming those dialectics or those like, and also a way of like, for me, how do you deal with a figure that's not self-mythologizing, or like how do you deal with the body so it's not about a singular person, like it's trying to make things that are personal and then distanced, and thinking of those structural ironies are really important, if I understand your line of questioning with it.
Well, I mean, you're literally making these structures around your paintings. I was just talking about the structural irony of like I think we're on the same page in terms of like a picturesque containing both the present and the past, and presenting those kind of in a way for consideration, for reflection. Whereas with the constant like flow of imagery in a mediated landscape, you don't really have time for reflection. there's this reflective moment, but it's made possible by this kind of structural irony that you're kind of imposing. It's almost like a break. I mean, it's interesting to think about, you know, in this picture, the clamps and everything around your piece and as come like breaks for like the slipstream of imagery, you know.
Yeah, I think Gitte and I, and I'd love to hear her thoughts on, but I think both of us really deal with images through mania, which I think is the only way to deal with so many images, but we deal with it in pretty opposite terms, which I think makes this show really interesting, or I hope it does for people, which is mine is like the mania of accumulation. And this painting is 3 years worth of work, basically. And it's me, you know, it's a very physical collage thing where I'm wheeling around a projector, painting it, wheeling it back. You know, it's like a collage that's a physical rolling around to make the body. And I'm interested in those moments of detail within the swarm, but I think Gitte handles mania of imagery in that closed off, like super cherished, super finished idea of making. But I think we're both kind of feeling similarly about virtual space. Maybe, I don't know. What do you think, Gitte?
Yeah, well, definitely feeling overwhelmed by the sheer, just amount of information hitting our eyeballs. And I guess when we met, we were talking about collecting things, collecting images. And I suppose for me, it's maybe that I end up with less in my pictures in the end. I think where I have more is in the wireframe pieces, or in the digital pieces, or in the charms. I can sort of keep more imagery, or I like to, but the paintings are more quiet, I think. But yeah, with the digital work, I tend to keep more information.
Yeah, why don't we talk about these particular works, because we didn't touch on them as much, because they're, you know, for people who haven't seen the show, they're discreet, they're small, and they're hung in conjunction sometimes with the paintings, but sometimes on their own, and they feel like charms.
Yeah, like the little amulets, sun catcher things.
Right. Again, there's like a pop cultural reference there. Something you might see in a head shop or something. Or, you know, in some spiritual, like with crystals or something like that. Or
Well, I mean, I started making these last year. But they do remind me of like, I guess when I was little, I used to make these little kind of sun catcher things with my mom, with like glitter glue and glass and like aluminium foil and things like this. So these are maybe just more sophisticated versions of that. But I think firstly, it's a great way to disseminate my work, because I can fold them up really small and like ship them all over the world. And they incorporate like sculptural elements, I suppose, through these little like chains and trinkets. So and they digitally like transferred prints onto plexi. So I like that kind of, it's like a low art, I would say low art, but like, it feels very playful and like quick compared to the paintings, I guess. And I think they're interesting in relation to them. And they have
these little pink balls on the bottom.
little pom-poms, are like bunny tails.
There's an element of like, you know, self-reflective humor in these.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's kind of like yeah, I like they literally I get the like little butterflies from the dollar store. Yeah, it's very much like I remember saying to my mom last year, if 5-year-old me was like, oh, this is what you would be doing as a 30-year-old. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I kind of just get to like play around doing, yeah, like doing this like kind of, yeah, like finding like cute stuff that would like really thrill like a younger version of myself, which I think is really important when you're an artist, like is really to not take yourself too seriously, at least for me, because I did go to art school for 4 years and it can really like suck it out of you. So I think, yeah, I think that's super important to just like really like play around with materials and stuff. Like even if it's like silly little pom-poms, it doesn't matter. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it as well.
You know, that kind of seriousness too goes along with what Andrew's saying about sincerity being on the irony being on the sincerity spectrum. I wouldn't call these works like ironic, but like the way you're able to subsume, like maybe the 16-year-old version of you would like love the fact that the 32-year-old version of you is like doing these, you know.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
finally, I have my resolution, you know.
Yeah. And they do have like a Catholic reliquary kind of situation to them as well. They feel, especially this one, feels very like shrine like to me.
And it impressed me too that these feel like they could be inside your paintings too, like
Yeah.
on the wall, you know, kind of like a Durer or a Van Eyck painting, like these allegorical symbols within the interior, you know.
Yeah, well, it's like the lines and the shapes and like the drops become like kind of like painterly sort of lines or gestures, I guess.
Yeah, like in this one, the red and the blue, like I guess they're faux gems. They remind me of like they used to in the windows of drugstores. They used to have like a red and a blue kind of tinted water for some reason. It was symbolic of something. I mean, you don't see it anymore, but it was kind of like a symbol,
well, also
some alchemical thing, you know.
yeah, well, it's the red pill, blue pill.
Right, there you go. But you know, this is Apothecary as Alchemy, a friend G. Schwartz says. But this is definitely a place where you and Andrew, in terms of the working method, meet. You know, this kind of the inclusion of this kind of reliquary references.
Yeah.
I find I can't see them as interdependent of the paintings. I find them really rich in relation to the paintings.
Definitely, yeah. No, I agree. Well, yeah, I think like as I said before, I just feel like the paintings are giant amulets themselves.
Right.
They just very unwieldy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I can't fold them up. I can't pack them in my bag.
Yeah. These also have aspects of jewelry to them, you know.
Yeah,
Like they
totally.
could be worn as kind of like scapulas, as Catholic devotional scapulas.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, when I started this project, or when I started making these, I really wanted to make them out of all kinds of different materials. I wanted to make them out of grass and wood and I don't know, like acorns. um they just, I don't know, I've sort of, life got the better of me. I ran out of any time, but yeah, if I if I have some time, I'd love to try something else, like actually draw the little picture that goes with the chains and things like this. So yeah.
But the off the shelf thing is interesting though, because it's like, it again, it takes into consideration the discussion of kitsch.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
kind
and it's also like, it's honestly how I make a living. So the fact that I can reproduce them is an important aspect of them.
right.
Yeah.
Do either of you want to add anything? Like, do you think we've missed anything in our discussion?
I'd just say, like, for me, like the frame elements, like I love reliquaries and shrines, and I do think about them, but I think about them very practically. It's just like, as a why I love painting and why I feel like I have to paint to address the feed is, like, as a painter, I don't feel like I'm like a concluder of anything. Like, I want to be a rememberer of the way all this is felt. And since I try not to conclude, the frames, that reliquary system, or that, kind of thing to clamp it down and put it together, feels like the moment where it can at least go out into the world as like a concluded thing. Like, I don't work on them after they have those frames on them.
But interesting, Andrew. Speaking of mania, it seems like these feel like provisional, and despite their really cool fabrication, like they really feel like they're not going to be able to contain. Like,
yeah,
they don't seem particularly efficient systems of containment.
no, I mean, I always liked. There's that. Was it? It was that Mike Kelly show last year. I'm trying to remember if it was at Hauser and Wirth or where it was at. But he had his big shaped paintings there, and you look at the back system of how those things are held together, and it's totally anti-logic. They're like 2x4s that serve no purpose to make the thing stay on the wall. And I think that, again, for me, it's like, I guess that's a fastidiousness, or like a lore building, or being interested in building lore, is that, like, I was less interested in having these 3D printed because I just thought that would be the more obvious thing to do. And I wanted to make everything, see what happened when it had to get translated through the wood shop and then the mold and the cast. Yeah.
But
I hope that's effective.
Conceptually, it looks to me like, those crabs that put all that stuff on the back there, on the back of the shell, to kind of whether they're camouflaging themselves or making themselves attracted to their mate, or those bowerbirds that collect all this stuff. This kind of, there is a mania, kind of a provisional mania there.
And there's a game, it's a Japanese game, and I forget how to pronounce it, but the god of the world destroys the whole world, and you're the main character having to rebuild it, and things are everything in the world magnetizes to you, and you become this clump that slowly becomes a bigger and bigger clump that eventually is the size of a whole planet, and you recreate the universe by, like, rolling over, like, restaurants and buildings and skyscrapers. And I love that identity of self through manic accumulation. That's something I think about a lot.
I love that. That's great. Well, so I think we could perhaps move to questions. We have a lot of really great questions in the chat, and I just want to thank you both. It's been so enlightening, and a real pleasure to work with both of you on this. And so I'll hand it over to Eleanor.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. That was so lovely. Thank you so much, Gitte and Andrew. That was just amazing to hear about. And yeah, we do have a lot of great questions from the audience. Our first question is from Josie. Josie, if you would like to unmute, you can. Otherwise, I'll ask for you, Josie. Josie is wondering about the title. She would like to hear about more about where it came from.
For both of us or for Gitte?
I think the title of the show.
Oh. Um, I mean, Gitte and I just wrote back and forth to each other for a few months trying to figure it out. And for me, that phrase was just trying to get in a poetic way, uh, the way the dream space still has presence, a physical presence in the real world. And also there's like a poisoned presence to all of it. There's like a pain there. And that felt like, I don't know. Gitte, how do you think about the title?
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. Like, yeah, I mean, Andrew wrote the title, so I feel like, yeah, you you the expert on talking about it. I was really happy. Yeah, I was really happy with the title.
Well, I wrote like 300 titles, and Gitte was the editor. So I feel like even though I wrote it, I feel like you sensing that was the one was important.
Yeah, yeah, it had this like, I don't know, I don't want to use the word fairy tale, but it has that sort of like, yeah, like dream like sort of quality of, yeah, it does feel a bit like a knight going to rescue a princess, cutting his hand open in the process, kind of, yeah, but maybe finding something beautiful behind the veil. Yeah.
Yeah, I love
Awesome.
that.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the question, Josie. Our next question will be from GE.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Gitte, and thank you, Andrew. This just goes everywhere. I wish I could see this show really soon. Amidst the use of all the worldly influences in both your works, because I see such a deep embrace between, of both the works in this show. Of all the works like video games, I'm thinking of things like Death Stranding, other things like alchemy and manga. I see the working of a kind of kenosis, sort of that self-emptying. Do you both or either of you feel you create these images as a way to self-empty, to see sort of past death, to safeguard, to mask, and extend us, all of us, through these use of avatars and symbols?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say. Yeah. Yeah, I feel, I don't know. I mean, I know, Andrew, you said that you don't particularly feel like making art is not necessarily, it's, yeah, you can't say it's like therapeutic necessarily, because I never feel like, I can't say I ever feel resolved, because it's like the emptying process is never done necessarily. But I think it's definitely a way to contemplate death, because you are externalizing parts of yourself all the time. In a sense, like I definitely have this feeling that because I'm making physical objects that are extensions of myself, it's a way to like ward off. Yeah, like my friend wrote, like warding off or seeing past death in a way. So it's like you're immortalizing yourself, not in like an arrogant way, but yeah. Not that I feel uncomfortable with death, but it's a great space within to contemplate. Yeah. What do you think, Andrew?
I agree. I mean, like I think about death on unhealthy levels, like I'm sure a lot of people in this room do. But I mean, I do think of the paintings as like playlists or a way of marking time, that like I have such a difficulty processing and remembering time, like when I thought something was funny or when something mattered to me, especially virtual space, that like each painting to me marks that that archive, you know, in a way that I hope is not solipsistic, but I hope that other people can also remember these markings of time as well. But you know, like Gitte and I, yeah, I don't know. Like I'm a very different person after the fire. Like I didn't cut my hair for 3 years. You know, like there are ways that this painting is not therapy, but it was a way of grounding like all these experiences and senses of time that I was having difficulty managing, I think.
Mm.
Thank you so much, GE. And thanks, Andrew and Gitte, for that. Our next question is going to be from Jeremy. Oh, we can't hear you quite yet, Jeremy. We could go to another question and come back, or should I read your question? For right now, try one more time.
Okay, maybe you can hear me now.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Andrew and Gitte. I love the show, and I was trying to. When I walked in into the space, my first thought, like immediately, was like, oh, these are paintings of the internet. Like this is the like so much of at least my experience of being online and traversing between physical space and the digital space and go is like there's an overwhelming amount of structure, like in the way we create, in the way where we place things, where we put things, where we send things and whatnot. And this is like, it felt like the whole show was like a, you know, the 50,000-foot view of it, and when you take a step back from the way media moves, and it's like it is that manic space, that meat space. Like it's messy and it's dirty, and that's not the side of things that gets shown to us often. It's this kind of it's the internet that shows up in the dreams and the anxieties and stuff. So like I also felt like, like in both your works, I was like, oh, are these in any way influenced by AI generation? And I was trying to like figure out like what would the prompts be to kind of get this, because this really is like, in some ways it was promptless. It was kind of hard to, like, you can't generate like these images with AI. And I appreciated that. And then especially like the lack of the frame in Andrew's work, which I think made it less of an object. Like a Cicely Brown is messy, you know, but it's an object, and this is not an object. This was yeah, I just really enjoyed that. And the one question, the question I kept wondering is like, is the color palette, like, any thoughts on like where the, you know, why those specific colors between the both of you, I guess? Or
For me, mine is like really conceptual, or like it's the colors of a blown bubble, or like a bubble that you like, but that is also a color that has a relationship to screens. It's more RGB channeled than CMYK, and I've just always been suspicious and intrigued that like that light system of color has a form of addiction to it, or some type of like trapping or enticement, that like it's the same color palette of like Final Fantasy games. It's also the bubble. It's also behind the counter. It's like the condom, or like the self, you know, like you take this tablet that is suspicious and it keeps you up all night. There's like an addictive pharmaceutical pharmacon color palette to it that's also a virtual color. And I like that for whatever reason, that RGB channeled color is about trying to get you to never leave the game.
yeah.
The way I choose color is very intuitive, I would say. I mean, I guess I would start by, I don't know, like say blue, or I don't know, but it's intuitive rather than conceptual, I would say. It's not really, I can't say that I have a a conceptual basis to my coloring so much, but there's definitely a thread that ties all the paintings together. Like when I stand in the space, I can see that they all make sense together. But it's it's an emotive response to color, and it's like when I move through like the urban landscape, I respond to certain colors more than others, and I take photographs and like collect things of similar shapes or similar colors, and those are things I respond to and things I put into my paintings. So yeah.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Jeremy. And our final audience question today before our poetry reading from Katie will be from Albert. Albert, you can unmute.
Hello. Congrats on the show, guys. Great talk. My question for you guys is seeing the show briefly while I was at the gallery. I feel like when an artist makes a work of art, can be like an intention to sort of like draw in the viewer to function in a very specific way. And in the way that both of your work plays with each other in the sort of vacillation between like a confined virtual space and a limitless and like very open virtual space, I wonder if there is a sort of intention for either of you to bring a viewer in and function in a certain way, where maybe Gitte, you would have someone roaming these like halls with some intention of kind of finding the sort of like sensitivity that you put into your work, and with Andrew, maybe this sort of like this like open confusion to like navigating the space beyond those walls, or like clipping past those walls. And if you hope like users would ultimately find a sense of what you're trying to sort of like promulgate through the composition of like these virtual spaces in a way. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting that you use the word user. Like using a painting, I think is an interesting idea. But I guess it like links to what I said earlier about thinking of like a painting as a giant playing card. Because in that sense, I do think of it as something to use. And you are using it as a space to contemplate. So in that sense, yeah, I suppose I just want my paintings to bring people some kind of psychological relief. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, I paint because I just want to connect to other people. So I hope that I hope that they feel connected to me through my painting, and they feel like less alone in the world, and they can enter into my into my world,
Logging on.
or into that world. It's
Logging
not
on into the
necessarily
site.
my world once I let it go, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, Albert. I think I don't want to say too much because I really do want the people to interact with the work to not feel like there's a single way like that I want them to do anything, but it is like the question, and like I think that like I think of it in terms of trying to just be uncomfortable for like as long as I can in the studio, and like hopefully something can be generated by me feeling uncomfortable and not concluding and not coming to like a structure, that maybe there's a generosity there of like these are paintings that I hope reward long looking, that like you can really change with them and grow with them, hopefully in the way that I did for years, but also that's impossible, you know? So I think I just hope something can be sustained. and ambivalent, that I really am not a techno-utopic. I don't believe that technology is either good or bad, but I hope that, like, by trying to be uncomfortable for a very long time with this work, maybe that does something, or like that helps other people with their alienation that we all feel, or I feel, you know.
Yeah. Well, you guys did that perfectly, I think. I felt that from on both ends, so it's very successful.
Thank you.
Same.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much for that question, Albert. That was great. And thank you. I know there are so many great questions we got today from the audience, and I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them, but thank you all for sending them in. Feel free to, connect afterwards to talk about them. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our NSEs with a poetry reading. And today I am so thrilled to welcome Katie Naughton to the stage. Katie Naughton is the author of the poetry collection, The Real Etheria, and the Chapbooks Study and a Second Singing, which is forthcoming. Her poetry has been published or is forthcoming in Fence, Bennington Review, Colorado Review, and elsewhere. She's a doctoral candidate in poetics at SUNY Buffalo and an editor at Essay Press, the However and How to Digital Project, etc., which is a web journal of poetry and poetics. Katie, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for including me. It's great to hear about your work, Gitte and Andrew. I'm going to read some poems from a manuscript in progress called Debt Ritual, where I'm thinking about debt and anxiety and shame around it, but also its relationship to opportunity and pleasure. And I've picked out some poems from a part of the manuscript I don't read from very often, but sort of in keeping with the work for today, which I'm trying to think a little bit about the way image acts as a unit of exchange, and thinking about alternative units of exchange, and also a little bit about the small unnecessary thing. Okay. Debt Ritual, Savings Bank. The building on the corner of 96th and Amsterdam, a temple in the Greek idiom, pillars set down directly on the sidewalk with presidents, Jefferson, save and teach all you are interested to save, thus pave the way for moral and material success, Lincoln. Teach economy. That is one of the first and highest virtues. It begins with saving money. The 1920s took down 2 tenements to put it there. Now it's a CVS and a private preschool. I could say some obvious things about tenements, preschool, tuition, and who might save what. I could say something about the instructional ambitions of bank walls, American presidents, and the Grecian ideals of political and economic American architecture. Like, was this place doomed to be an expensive preschool by the tone of the inscriptions over its doors? I guess the advice, though, is basically sound: to keep carefully what you don't need today and let it grow. I could add the bank was the first to welcome women immigrants, that it served wealth then maybe against wealth, that it was done in by high interest rates, by bad investments by the 1970s. I could say something obvious about what the wall doesn't know about early 21st century interest rates, or about need and excess, about precarity, or that my lifelong poverty line grandmother's advice was, if you have it, use it for what you were interested in, and instantly feel I need to defend her nevertheless near complete and necessary frugality, the insistence on virtue not accidental. The poem's already there in the words on the corner in the lobby, now full of light medical equipment and snack food, a place we might have walked, have bought some small unnecessary thing. Exchange. What for a patterned curtain, for a teenager scrolling through her phone across the table from her divorced father? What for crocuses and snowdrops? What for the discovery, finally, of the chicken coop behind the Presbyterian church? What for a bright color of paint on the fingernails? What for the bright mouth on Sunday? What for shoes, mine and yours? What for a spring day and a draft beer? What for the plaque on the fence, the dog on the other side? What for an etiquette book entry on how to text someone condolences? What for a pharmacy on Saturday? What for the phone before receiving bad news? What for the two collarless cats on the porch? What for the steep, short driveway and the subterranean garage? What for what might have previously been a root cellar? What for a patterned curtain, for oak floors, for a root cellar, for a driveway, for a garage, for the phone, for the bad news, for a pharmacy, for a Saturday, for an etiquette book, for a text message, for a fence, for a dog, for a spring day, for a draft beer, for shoes, for mine, for yours, for a bright mouth, for a color of paint, for a chicken, for a church, for a teenager, for a father, for a patterned curtain. What? Exchange. For the pink paper ticket for the next bus, for the traffic of a sunny crosscut intersection and who is crossing, who is on the bus, what cars are reflecting sunlight, for the heat of the asphalt, for your friend's favorite strain of weed, for the wide bands of the crosswalk, for the maximum amount of bright fabric, for the bathrooms of expensive banks, for forgetting, for the absolute necessity of exuberant spring growth, the plant adding what matter matters, so much of it. For what you came here for, the life of people on a shaded street in sun, erratic flagstone, and all their languages and food, what is thought, felt, and made. For a pool of olive oil, salt suspended in it. For the mid-century armchair on the curb on garbage day, you call a cab or friend, bring it home, and where it stays for decades. For the unrenovated walk-up converted to condos, for private apartments offered under market rate for no reason, for canceling the weekly vegan potluck after too many offerings of tortilla chips and bags of Oreos, for standing in the open doorway of the coffee shop, wanting the bulletin board of a previous decade and going home to search for a roommate on Craigslist, for the bank lobby, for the subway transfer to the bus down Flatbush to the beach on a weekday afternoon, for the neighborhoods you've never been to and all the people and their food languages there, for the stores the width of one building in the idiom of some other region and its habits of commerce, for calling things a way to be with other people and being partially right, for plastic bottles of water bought at the bodega, for bringing your own water bottle to save $2 2 or 3 times per day, for a bacon, egg, and cheese on a hard roll, for where you can use the bathroom and how to wait, for grape hyacinth, for the heavy hungover feeling of a cloudy Sunday, for what is sounded in public voices, phone calls, traffic, heavy breathing, sometimes song, radios, bird, for the $5 dinner at the ashram before the Sangha, for $15 dosas with goat cheese and beets in Soho and the Upper West Side, for the restaurants cab drivers stop at, for the pockets of unchanged neighborhoods found at points inconvenient to subway lines, for 3-2-1-2-1, for what remains, for the flowering trees, apples, and cherries in the cemetery in April, for the heat of exhaustion with the sun warms, the first baffling day of its reappearance as more than light, for coming down the block where the canopy meets overhead when the leaves are just coming out and turning the corner to the avenue, for a bagel for breakfast, falafel pita for lunch, or a half pint of beer, for the piano at the jam session after the gig, and this is also the public of the late bar with friends, for it's so late we're alone together out here. 2 short ones to wrap up. Double coincidence of wants. Hot dogs on a July afternoon and a farm stand tomato, melon and health, the warm, clear blue continuing forever, and the possibility of something changing. Image it as the partial dissolution of something solid and what might make way through that material field, wearing the same black bathing suit for its coverage and ease of slipping under some activities' clothing, provisioned for efficiency and the well-turned line of something beautiful and new, looking like a photograph of money absent a home. Double coincidence of wants. I want an evening that feels like tomorrow is going to be a snow day in 1992 and going outside in the dark with my father when the snow's up to my knees and coming down, and the neighbors coming around on snowmobiles through the not quite yet suburban streets. What's laid aside and left alone, a pause in vocation, and what connected us then and always, a sound and a surface laid down particulate on another surface that was always there. How one becomes more obvious, the motor's distant and nearer, what one touches you, and extending outwards everything else. That's what snow is newly every time. And so is everyone coming outside, home, awake at odd hours, the decades after the houses, their habits, the weather, me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was so beautiful. A really, really perfect, special way to conclude the conversation today. And a huge thanks again to Andrew and Gitte and Tom for the really, really wonderful dialogue. And thanks also to Alex from Rachel Uffner Gallery for helping us to prepare for today. So supportive. And we'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the NSE and for making these daily conversations possible. They also support our archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel and where this conversation will be posted very soon. For the past 23 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and our public events like our daily NSE. Check the chat for a link to donate to support the work we do here at the Rail. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Eric N. Mack and William Corwin on the event of Mack's solo exhibition at Paula Cooper Gallery. We will conclude tomorrow with a reading by Mohammed Zenia. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. And you can now turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Thanks, everyone. Great conversation today. Congratulations.
Thank you, Tom.
Great shows.
Congratulations.
Thank you both so much.
Great. Thank you so
Congrats,
much.
Andrew.
Thanks for that great poem,
Thank
Katie.
you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Katie. Wonderful poem. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks.
To